Everyone, our learning outcomes for Unit 7 include to describe and analyze colonialism. Colonialism is a term that can be defined as when a country conquers and rules over other regions. It means exploiting the resources, the people, and land of the conquered territory for the benefit of the conqueror. It's related to the word imperialism, which means growing an empire, expanding into neighboring regions, and expanding dominance. The terms are similar and related. Imperialism is a little bit older, think like the Roman Empire. And colonialism began around the 1500s, with empires like the British becoming an imperial power in places like India. We will talk a lot about that today. The United States was an imperial power in Puerto Rico, which is now considered a commonwealth, and the people born there have U.S. citizenship and equal rights if they move to one of the 50 states. But if people stay in Puerto Rico, they are still in many ways treated as a colony, which is kind of interesting. And the United States also was an imperial colonial power over the Philippines after the Spanish-American War of 1898. And all the way through the beginning of World War II when Japan took over the Philippine territory. And it wasn't until after World War II that the Philippines gained independence, which is kind of interesting to think about. And the territories that we will talk about are India, Africa, and Southeast Asia. And those are the colonies. And the colonial case studies, the imperialist powers that took over are the British, the Belgians, and the Dutch powers. And the time frame is the middle of the 18th century, or the middle of the 1700s, through the middle of the 20th century, which is the middle of the 1900s. Really a little bit earlier on, the early 1900s, but we will connect the dots and discuss further, just to show a connection. As always, our ID words, map IDs, and timeline IDs are here in the beginning of the PowerPoint so that you can quickly access them if needed. And our focus question, and we'll talk about it here for just a minute and we'll review it again in the coming slides, but it's important to read and think about now because when we talk about it, we'll look at the history and it's important to think about this question. So assess the assigned textbook readings, the lectures, PowerPoints, and pay careful attention to the 4 primary source documents. These are really interesting perspectives, Indian perspectives on British colonialism in India from about a 100-year period from 1823 till 1909. That's when the 4 sources are written. And the focus question is, how and why did Indian opinions of British colonial rule change over the century? In other words, what historical and or personal experiences affected Indian opinions? In order to answer this question, you have to make an argument and present, first of all, the main points and arguments of each author. There are 4 authors. And then assess the historical events that occurred in India when each source was written. What was going on? Who was in power? How were things working? How was the social structure like? Who had influence and why and how? And then describe the personal experiences and social status each Indian writer had under the control of the British. That has an influence on their thoughts and belief systems. And then lastly, argue the how and why the opinions changed. As always, include the 5 W's, how, why important, etc., and cite your sources. Okay, here we go. When we are discussing European colonialism in India, Africa, and in Southeast Asia, we have to think about European desires. Namely, like we see in so many other parts of the world, they want gold and diamonds, which are very valuable for jewelry making and just as money exchange. Ivory, which comes from the tusks of animals like elephants. An extraordinary number of elephants were killed during European colonialism because Europeans really liked the white bone that things were made out of. And so literally hundreds of thousands of elephants were murdered just for their tusks. Their tusks were cut off and they were left to die. Really quite horrifying. Now the ivory trade has become illegal, thank goodness, but it still happens because it is still a lucrative business. Also, Europeans wanted land, namely for things like fields to produce goods like cotton, and timber, namely for rubber trees to make things like tires eventually, and then markets. Markets are places to sell finished products. So European colonial powers take raw materials from colonies in places like India, Africa, and in Southeast Asia, and they produce them into manufactured items in Europe with their machines, namely, and then they send them back to the markets in Africa, Asia, and in Southeast Asia to sell, and they sell these goods, these finished products, for a very high rate. And of course, they also want labor power to work in those fields, in those plantations, and in the mines. There's this idea of new imperialism, which equals economic colonialism, and this is from 1840 till 1914. So after the desire for colonialism to be slightly suppressed, a new imperialism comes into power, and that's an economic colonialism where European superpowers are more influential based only on the economy. Of course, that's not true because they are involved in other things as well, because when you're involved in an economic aspect, you're controlling the people and the land as well. So the idea behind this is called mercantilism. Mercantilism is based on the idea that the world is like a pie and there's a limited amount of the world and everybody wants a bigger slice. And in order to get a bigger slice, they have to be more powerful. And if you are more powerful, that is correct. That is righteous. That is according to God. And so the idea of might equals right is a big basis to what mercantilism is. And how does it work? Well, first world nations, I put quotations around first world. That is a very contentious term because it kind of implies that people in the first world are first, are awesomest, are the bestest. I'm using improper grammar here to prove a point. First world people are industrialized markets and places. Generally speaking, urbanized, meaning people who live in cities as opposed to in rural areas or in farms. And industrialized, meaning big factories are the rule, not the exception. And first world peoples become colonizers, and they exploit other people. They take goods from their colonies. And so the third world people, again in quotation marks, because again, if someone is called coming from the third world, it kind of sounds like they're third place. They're not first place. They're kind of lower on the rank of social and political and economic power. And that's, it also sort of implies that people in the first world are better somehow. But third world nations are not industrialized. They generally have small businesses, smaller farms, more rural. They are not urbanized. They are more farmland type, living in separated places rather than in big cities. And they are the people who are colonized, the areas, the territories who are under the control of the colonizers. And these third world, not industrialized people are the suppliers of raw materials and the markets where the first world people sell their goods. There is also, of course, the degradation of nature, meaning the destruction of nature. Mining, as we discussed in the last unit, just destroys the environment. You cut down trees in order to be able to get to the goods underneath, and taking out trees ends up removing the topsoil. And all of, when you mine, you cut down basically mountains in order to get minerals and metals from inside of the mountain, or diamonds or gold, things like that. And all of the toxic materials that are used and all of the stuff that comes out that is waste goes right into the rivers and into the air. So mining really is hard on nature, and the use of fossil fuels to burn as opposed to renewable energy, that has a really big challenge. And in general, a lot of many trees are cut down, a lot, because farms need to be produced to create big plantations for mass products, cash markets basically, things that are sold for cash. How does mercantilism work? Well, European colonizers use what is called tools of empire. So first of all, with the industrialization, with European superpowers industrializing and creating factories to create tools and products, this propels the European world into military superiority. So first they start out by producing things like muskets, which is an early form of gun, and you load the bullets, and then you load the gunpowder, and you pack it all in there, and then you can pull the trigger. And that turns into rifles that are breech loading on the side, and then eventually you can put in a bullet that has the bullet and the gunpowder all in one casing, and that's much faster to load. And then you just load it and fire. And then eventually they create the Maxim gun, which is an early form of a machine gun, and it could shoot 11 rounds a minute. And that's a big deal when you're comparing that to a musket that shoots a bullet every 2 minutes or so. And of course, other machines are created with industrialization, namely tools for all sorts of different products, and steel-hulled ships that are run on steam power, steam ships, steam engines. And that's huge as compared to wind power and sails. The people who have ships that are steel-hulled with steam engines, they can go anywhere they want a lot faster than everyone else. So that definitely gives them the upper hand as far as military superiority goes. In addition, European colonizers increase nationalism. Nationalism can be kind of a bad word if it's taken in the wrong direction, but nationalism is basically pride in someone's nation. And in this case, pride in your own European nation would lead to putting down other people, both in other nations in Europe and in other parts of the world, like in Africa and in India and in Southeast Asia. Because if you're awesome, everyone else has to be less than you. And that creates a dichotomy, a social split between the superpowers and those who have less power, have less industrialized stuff. And that also leads to increased cultural superiority, of course. That's maybe the definition for that, or the name of that. And that also leads to the idea of social Darwinism. We've already discussed this, but basically Darwin's theory of evolution is that an animal or a plant species will survive if it is fit to survive in different forms of nature, different temperatures, things like that. Social Darwinism takes that idea and turns it into might equals right. If you are more powerful, then you will survive. And if you are more powerful, that definitely is based on the type of military superiority you have, the types of tools you have, the types of bigger guns, etc. So this leads to what is called the Great Game. And this is based again on the idea of might equals right. The Great Game is the game that Europeans, quote unquote, played to take a hold of other parts of the world and control it. So Europeans literally thought, oh, the French are going to go there. I need to go there faster and harder and take over. And that's how so much of the world was split into European superpowers controlling other parts of the world like Africa and in Asia. And here's that image of social Darwinism with the white male at the top in the center and the most powerful, and the list goes down and the faces go down and get darker and more Asian and more Indian and blacker as you go down. And so the top goal of all humans is to become like that white Englishman, Anglo-Saxon. And this, of course, also leads to the ideas that the white people are the super race and everyone else is lesser. So that again instills more racist philosophies and ideas, and it creates this idea that white people deserve to be on top because they were built that way by God. In regard to the new imperialism, there are a lot of political contradictions and hypocrisies. At home in Europe, there are revolutions to create more democracy and a more republican form of ruling, where first land-owning males end up taking power and having the right to vote. And then eventually that right to have a say in government spreads to more men. This does not include women until the early 1900s, the early 20th century. Women don't get the right to vote until then, and neither do slaves or people who are considered to be in very similar slave-like statuses, such as indentured servants. But the right to vote and the right to have a say in government expands dramatically from the late 18th century forward, from the late 1700s forward. And there's a huge push for modernization in Europe as well. There are technologies and buildings and the desire to create and grow and develop, and that's seen as a positive thing in Europe. In the colonies, however, modernizing is seen as kind of hypocritical and inauthentic, and so there's a desire to keep modernization and technology out of colonies, and instead they're ruled by dictatorships from European superpowers. And the colonies in places like Africa and India and in Asia, they're kept rural and traditional because that is seen as more authentic, more real, and we want to be nice to those people and keep them the way they are. Of course, that completely suppresses their ability to grow and develop like we see in Europe and in America as well. But we're talking about those types of colonial powers, and so they're kept kind of traditional. There's also something called gendering in the empires, which means that white men are considered or viewed as virile and powerful and strong and sexual and masculine, and men who are not white, men from the colonies in Africa and in India and in Asia, are kind of effeminized. They become weaker or viewed as weaker unless they're part of what is called a martial race, a group of people who are naturally part of a powerful group of people who will make great soldiers underneath these superpowers and can work for the superpower colonies. And women, white women, have to be protected from black men and Indian men and Asian men because all of those men are barbarous and animalistic and aggressive and will rape your white women. So white women are very much protected. And black or colored women are kind of seen as slightly more masculinized and animalistic and sexual, and all of these things are very negative in the European perspective. Just a quick review of British rule or British influence in India. It starts out with a great deal of cooperation. The British come into India and they have to kowtow, they have to bow down. It starts with the English East India Company, the EEIC, around the early 1600s. And the EEIC, again, is a joint stock company. They are a group of people who come together with money to support an independent business, but they have the support of the British military, which is a trip to think about. How do you have a private business being supported by the British military? Similar to maybe, say, McDonald's going into another country and having the American military protect the rights of McDonald's, not the people in McDonald's, but the actual company itself. And they come into the Mughal Empire, which is a Muslim empire, and it is a very strong and powerful empire. The Mughals were foreigners from Mongolia. They came down into India, and the majority of the population in India, as you all know, I'm sure, is Hinduism. So there's 80% Hindu population and a 20% Muslim population. And it's a pretty powerful empire. And when the EEIC comes in, they have to beg to just trade there. Eventually, however, the Mughal Empire splinters in the mid-17th century, in the mid-1600s, and by the 1707, it's greatly weakened. Who comes in and influences in a much stronger way? The EEIC, again, a private company, an independent business. And they set up trading posts originally in places like Calcutta and Madras and Bombay, which used to be called Mumbai. And these end up becoming big cities. The trading posts, again, are originally just military supporting a business. It's not women and children, but eventually these trading posts end up becoming really big cities, being under the control of the EEIC. Here's a map with some of those big, important cities in India. They don't have Calcutta, which is down here somewhere. They don't have Calicut, which is down here, but there's Calcutta, there's Mumbai, which was the same as Bombay, and just a few other big names here. This is India. Europe is to the top left, and China is to the right, or eventually to the right. Under British rule in India, was there cooperation from the 1700s until 1857? Yes, in a lot of ways, but it was a challenged form of cooperation. The EEIC and the British military had control over local collaborators. There were local leaders who supported the British EEIC, and this includes local sepoys, who are Indian soldiers in the British military, and there were local administrators, Indians in the British administration, as kind of middlemen, representatives, and communicators between the British superpower and the local people. And there were rajas, local rulers, local princes, and a lot of them thought, well, the British are very, very powerful. They have a lot of great industry. If I get in good with them, I will have more power, and eventually India will become more powerful too because we will collaborate and work together. So there was definitely a great deal of cooperation. However, there were some challenges. We'll talk about the challenges in a moment. And this is very similar to what we see in Africa with African chiefs of local territories who would work with other European superpowers to increase their own power and influence and help their own people in what they thought was the best way possible by cooperating with European powers. There was a small number of Western educated elites in both India and in Africa, people who are Indian and African who ended up going to Europe to get educated in the universities in Europe. And this provided these people with a kind of interesting path to slightly more power and more influence. If someone could read and write, if they were literate in the colonizer's language, if they could read and write in English or in French or in the Dutch language or whatever other European language, that gave them a huge upper hand because they could communicate, they could read, and they were seen as very useful. So they made a lot more money and had a lot more power and influence in their own towns, in their own world. There was, however, what is called a glass ceiling And we see this in regard to women all the time. But here we're talking about people who were colonized in Africa, India, and Asia, Southeast Asia in particular. And even if they had the best education and were smarter and more successful than the British or other superpowers, they were never allowed to have equal positions than them. They were always kept in lower positions because that provides power to those European superpowers. Finally, we come to the challenges of British rule in India. The Indians kind of considered themselves to be equals until the 1930s, but again, they were not given the type of political power or positions or business positions or power as compared to their European counterparts. Even if they had the same type of education, even if they were better at their job than the Europeans were, they were still not really treated as equals. But there was this idea that it was possible to become equal, that if they worked hard enough, they could attain that. It was never the case, but there's this idea that it was possible until around the 1830s, and then things start to sour. And then the idea comes across that the British want to create a quote-unquote Little England, meaning we're going to make India more like England. We're going to get rid of or reduce the native ideas and things, and we're going to replace them with English things, starting with language. So the Sanskrit and other languages that are talked, spoken, and written in India, we're going to replace that with English. And the religion in India, we don't really think Hinduism is that great, and we're going to promote Christianity. And the culture, and then here's an interesting one, plants. People who are British, of British descent, want to eat and drink things that are familiar to them. So they start planting things that are familiar to them, tea in particular, and cotton, and then opium starts to be manufactured in a sense in India. And the English don't smoke opium, but they eventually end up selling opium to China, because the Chinese don't really want anything else aside from silver, and the European superpowers run out of silver, so they provide opium, which is illegal, to China, and it's grown in India. And of course, the English industrial machines come in, and the machines end up replacing a lot of the manual laborers, which is a challenge in India for jobs. And the power itself, the English take over slowly in India, and they become more and more powerful. So they are reducing the native influences and replacing them with English ones. A few more of the really big challenges under British colonial rule. There were condescending systems and sciences, and this is not just under British rule, but under other European rule in not just India, but in Africa and in Southeast Asia as well. These condescending systems, for example, with the British in India, they focused on keeping Indians in a traditional type of culture, based on Brahmanism, which is a big part of the Hindu culture. Brahmins are religious leaders, and they kind of are the rulers in a lot of ways as far as how the world works. And based on caste system, which we've already talked about this, but again, it's a social, political, and economic split between the people. And there are upper level castes. The Brahmins are the highest of that level. And it goes down to workers and lower castes that are considered less socially acceptable and have very little political power, and usually are very economically challenged, do not have money. And the British like keeping India in this traditional sense and in this traditional system, because that is seen as authentic and what is supposed to be in India. And this is very similar or akin to what Europeans do in what they call tribal Africa. And the chiefs are, like the Brahmins in India, kind of kept as powerhouses, but it is not a developed world. It is not an industrialized world. So they are kind of looked down upon. This is an old way of living, an old system, very traditional, and what Europeans would consider backwards. But they want to keep the people in these colonial areas in India and in Africa and in Southeast Asia in the systems that they have been in for hundreds, if not thousands of years, because that keeps the European superpowers in power. And the definitions change from a local definition of what a person is to a colonial definition. So prior to colonialism, in India, people were not considered Hindus. They would consider themselves whatever Hindu sect they were, and the traditions were localized to a particular region or a group or a Raj, a prince or king. In the Islamic worlds, they were, of course, separate. They were a different religion, but now there was a really big split. The British, in particular in India, wanted to define Muslims as a separate, not Hindu population, and this is kind of a means of separating to conquer, divide and conquer. And so the Muslims were defined and kind of were forced to see themselves to unite as Indians against, or against, as Muslims against the Hindus within India. And they were definitely not part of the Hindu culture in India. Prior to this, of course, there are separations between Hinduism and Islam, but the people would work together and eat together and etc. They lived in the same areas and they weren't considering themselves so separated. And this can be easily compared to Africa, where people used to consider themselves part of a local village or a kinship group, a family group, or an empire or a language group. And this changed to a definition of race and tribe. And this is a European colonizer definition of tribes. And eventually Africans took this on for themselves to define themselves as belonging to the African tribe. This is an image of what is called a durbar, an imperial durbar, and it's a procession, parade to show the people, to demonstrate the power and the wealth of the British Empire, the rulers at the time, the colonizers. And you see a lot of syncretism here. You see a blending of British and Indian culture. There are elephants that have carriages on them that are very British in style, and you see who's leading this procession. It is a British military commander who's wearing a big white hat in his British military uniform, and some woman, probably his wife, and they are being shaded with an umbrella that is being held by an Indian man. It is likely that this Indian is Sikh, S-I-K-H, and the Sikhs are considered part of the martial race, the military race of men, and a lot of Sikhs ended up being in the British military, as you can see based on the guy's hat up here, the turban that he's wearing here. And then all of the people down here are wearing Indian style outfits, but are definitely reminiscent of British attire, British military wear, especially the colors and the things that they're holding have the British royal crown on top, sitting on top of them. They're also holding guns, muskets, or rifles, which are military created and European created. And even though there is someone up here who is Indian who is sitting on an elephant, he's second in command or way down the line. There are a few elephants back here and they have Indian people in them. And those are likely a local Raj, a local prince or local princes who are higher ranking than the normal people in India, but again, the Europeans are the ones in lead. This image was made in 1903, and so we can definitely see that even though the British are powerful in 1903, their influence is blended with the Indian culture, in India at least, not so much in England. And definitely shows social rank, and there we go. Okay. A few more of the really big challenges that the British had in their rule in India. There were major abuses against Indian workers. And we're not just talking about being humiliated by British leaders. The Indians were actually physically beaten on a regular basis. They had very few rights, and the rights that they had were constantly being challenged. And the abuses against the workers started to take a toll. There was, of course, the idea of social Darwinism that a lot of people really thoroughly believed, or the idea of racism, of a superior race. And the Indians themselves, many did believe that the white people were superior to them, but there's only so much that someone can handle physical and mental abuse before they break and crack, and that's what we see coming. Again, racism, and then there's also that white man's burden, the idea that it is the need of white men to help the other races. The superior white race has to help the other races, and that's white man's burden. And they help them by turning them into slave-like workers and abusing them and beating them up to train them to become better people somehow. That's the logic or illogic behind social Darwinism and the idea of white man's burden and the moral push for colonialism in other parts of the world. And then one of the last big ones, the EEIC, the English East India Company, used sepoys in China. Now, sepoys, again, are Indians who are military men in the British Army. So they're Indians in the British military, and they take them in and use them in China as protection when they are selling that opium that is illegal in China. A problem with this is that the majority of the sepoys are Hindu, and they believe that if they die outside of India, their soul will not be reincarnated and they will not go to the next life, which is a really big fear for a lot of Hindus. And then lastly, the Enfield rifle. This changes things because the Enfield rifle is a lot more accurate than the musket. It's much faster to load because the bullets, again, have the bullet and the gunpowder in one casing. So rather than taking 2 minutes to load a gun, it takes a few seconds to load a gun, which is really impressive and time consuming. And the shot is not just more accurate, but it can go farther. So the Enfield rifle really changes the game and propels Britain to become even more powerful. A problem with the Enfield rifle and the bullets is that they are encased in something that uses animal fats, including pig or cow fat. Now, for people in India, if they are Muslim, they do not eat pig, and if they are Hindu, they do not eat cow. And the problem with the bullet being encased with cow or pig fat is that in order for it to work, you would have to bite the bullet and bite the casing. So the Hindus and Muslims thought that the British were literally trying to make them break their religion and their religious rules by eating the animals that are sacred to them or considered not halal, not kosher, not edible. You're not supposed to eat pig. And this was just a huge slap in the face and really seen as a push against the local cultures, the Muslim and Hindu cultures within India. So what happens? Rebellion. And rebellion happens in all colonies. But in the British rule, when the British are controlling parts of India, The rebellion happens in a pretty interesting way. Oops. One big example of one of the really big rebellions is the Indian Sepoy Rebellion, and it took place from 1957 through 1958. The British are extremely superior in their military capacity. They even end up creating the Maxim gun, which again is like an almost automated gun that shoots 11 bullets a minute. And racism increases tremendously based on the results of this rebellion. But what ends up happening is the Sepoys, those Indians who are part of the British military, they rebel, they turn against the British military, and they end up massacring many British men, women, and children. There's no regard for who the people are. If the people were British, these Sepoys were out to get them, and they did. The British, with their military superiority, however, returned the favor and absolutely annihilated Indian towns and villages and wiped people out completely. They fought back a lot harder than the Sepoys fought because they had the ability to with a superior military. And this ended the EEIC, the private joint stock company, the English East India Company, was deposed in a sense, and instead the British royalty formally took over, and it became what is known as the era of the British Raj, the British princes, basically, the British rule. And this lasted from 1858, from the end of the Sepoy Rebellion, through 1947, when India formally gained independence after World War II. During this almost 100-year period, India was considered the crown jewel of the English Empire because the English had so much power and control, and so many amazing, magnificent things came from India, like cotton and opium that was again sent to China, and tea. Additionally, the Suez Canal was finally established in 1869, and this allowed for east-west trade to go much faster. Rather than going all the way around Africa, the British could trade through the Mediterranean Sea and through the Red Sea down into India, and it would take, rather than 2 years, it would take 2 weeks. Additionally, opening the Suez Canal under British power allowed the British to tax anyone who wanted to go through there. Let's look at a map. There is the Suez Canal. England is up here. Britain is up here, these little islands. And it used to take 2 years to go all the way around Africa and go into India to trade. And instead, rather than 2 years, the British could then go through the Mediterranean Sea and down in through the Suez Canal, through the Red Sea, and into the Indian Ocean, into India, taking 2 weeks. It took off almost 2 years of travel time, which of course saved a lot of money and provided a lot of income for the British. And here's a close-up look of the Suez Canal right here. This is the Mediterranean Sea, and yeah, made it really easy for the British to come in through the Mediterranean Sea, skip through the Suez Canal, down the Red Sea, and into India over here. And not just the British could trade, but lots of other people. And when you pass through this Suez Canal, which saves 2 years off of your travel time, you end up paying the British a fat fee to go through. Okay, so again, the focus question, how and why did Indian opinions of British colonial rule change over the century? And what historical or personal experiences affected Indian opinions? We just talked about the historical events that occurred or what was going on in India when each source was written. We didn't specify each exact source. Here are the sources, the 4 primary source documents, but we did talk about the main ideas as to what was going on there. So again, remember to present the main points or arguments of each author, assess the historical events that occurred, so describe what was going on in India when each source was written, and describe the personal experiences and social status of each Indian writer under the control of the British. And these are all things that you need to kind of present, assess, and describe before you make that argument, or in addition to making the argument of how and why the opinions of Indian people changed over the century. So the first primary source document is by Ram Mohan Roy, written in 1823, and it's titled Letter to Lord Amherst. And it's about Indian people seeking Western education. The English have decided to build schools in India, which is wonderful, except for the English want to build Sanskrit schools to teach ancient Indian Hindu culture. And that is not what this Indian wants. He wants science and math and all of the important Western and productive and new and improved ideas that are coming forward through the British. And he doesn't really want the old things that they've had for millennia. Sanskrit is one of the oldest languages, and Indian culture is one of the oldest cultures in the world. It's one of my favorite subjects to teach about in early world history because it is so brilliant and interesting. But we've had that here in India, says Ram Mohan Roy, and instead he wants new things. He wants to learn English. He wants to westernize and become part of the 19th century, so to speak. The next date is 1857, and this is right around the Indian Rebellion. It's written by Prince Firoz Shah. The name Shah shows us that he is a Muslim leader. So this is a Muslim prince who writes the Azamgar Proclamation. And this is basically saying that if someone follows the British and supports the British, especially during this Indian Rebellion, that when the Indians rule and win, that those people will be considered betrayers and will lose everything. Whereas if people support the Indian Rebellion and get rid of the British, then they will return to their power and they will receive the wonderful things that they should receive, like proper education and their land and good jobs and equal pay, etc. So Prince Firoz Shah is very angry at the British. After the EEIC is kicked out and after the Royal British take over formally with the era of the British Raj, and that's 1858. The next one is written in 1871, and it's titled Credits and Debits of British Rule in India. The guy's name is Nairoji, and he wrote Speech to a London Audience. And he basically breaks down the great things that the British have done, gives them a lot of credits. You've provided us with education. You got rid of sati, which is the practice of a wife burning herself on her husband's funeral pyre if her husband were to die, and a lot of other great things that the British provide for the Indians in India. However, he also lists a great deal of debits of things that the Indians have not received that they have been promised by the British, like equal job opportunities, for example. And so it's kind of an interesting way of attempting to negotiate with the British to help propel the Indians into a more powerful position in their own country under the rule of the British. And then lastly, in 1909, we see a writing of one of my favorite people, Mahatma Gandhi, who's kind of considered the father of India. And he writes about modern globalization, and it's called Indian Home Rule. He wants to get rid of not just the British power, but the British influence. He thinks that their machines need to be removed, and technologies need to be removed, and their culture and their systems need to be removed, and India should go back to the way it was before the British influenced. And he thinks that his elders, his forefathers, were smart, and they actually were. If you look at early world history, the Indians were the most advanced in so many ways, including the most advanced sewer systems and water systems, and just brilliant people. And he thinks that the British have ruined things, and rather than modernizing and becoming more powerful, that they need to go back and become more moral. That's more important to him. So that's what those four, that's a very basic outline of what those four primary source documents talk about. And I think they're really interesting, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion of them in class. In India, there's an attempt to bridge the Hindu-Muslim divide. And it starts out a long time ago, in the 15th century, in the 1400s, and it's called a Bhakti Hindu movement. And there's a disregard for caste and for rituals, for Brahmanism, for example, and instead they focus on union with the divine, a connection just to God. And rather than splitting people into different religious groups and sects, they focus on unity and connecting to God. And then there's another religion that is created, which is kind of interesting. It's Sikhism. This is how it's pronounced, Sikhism. And it's led by a man named Guru Nanak. Guru is a leader, so Nanak was his name. In the mid-15th century is when he was born, and he ruled, or not ruled, but he led through 1539, through the early 16th century. And he focused on rejecting definitions of Hindus and Muslims, or Hinduism and Islam. And instead he focused on uniting people, and he did this in an interesting way with a communal kitchen. People would come together for their meals. I visited a Sikh temple when I was in college, based on the advice of my professor who was Sikh, S-I-K-H, not unhealthy, Sikh as in the religion. And it was one of the most amazing experiences. They welcome people with open arms. You don't have to pay for anything. It's all vegetarian food. It's beautiful. Everyone sits on the floor as equals, and it's a community there. They also wear a distinct dress, in particular their turbans, and they have a few other rules, like the men are not allowed to cut their hair. They have to be always clean, so daily showers and washing their hands all the time. And they have to carry a short sword, which is more symbolic today in a lot of parts of the world, except for maybe in the Punjab, which is in the northern region of India. But they became very militaristic, which is why they have to carry the short sword to defend themselves against which was started as Hindus and Muslims who hated them for kind of creating a different philosophy. It's threatening to the people. Here are a couple images. So the first one is the map, and this red territory is the Punjab, which is where the Sikh culture today centers. And this is the biggest Sikh temple in India. And this man, you can see he has a turban, the long beard, because you're not allowed to cut your hair, and the sword. My professor did not carry a little sword around. It was more of a symbol for him. Again, this is the Indian Empire as controlled by the British, and this includes modern-day Pakistan here on the west side, and on the other side there are several other nations. Okay, so we just finished up discussing the British colonies in India here, and now we are moving towards Indonesia in Southeast Asia down here. The Netherlands, or the Dutch East Indies, the islands that we will talk about include Java and Sumatra as a couple examples. So European conquests happened also in Africa and in Southeast Asia. And the time frame that we're dealing with here is the late 19th through the early 20th centuries. The Dutch, who lived or were from the Netherlands, went into Indonesia in Southeast Asia in a slow imperial creep, which is very similar to like what happened with the British Raj in India. The British Empire didn't just come into India and say, I'm here, I'm taking over, and use major force at all times. They slowly crept in with private companies, as they did in Indonesia, as the Dutch did in Indonesia, and they had military support for their private companies, and their military was far superior to what was seen in Southeast Asia, which is why they had so much ability. Europeans, similar to in other parts in Southeast Asia, they desired things like gold and diamonds and ivory and land and labor power, in addition to markets. And in this case, here in Southeast Asia, they held taxes. The colonial states regularly required colonized people to pay taxes in unpaid labor. And mainly it was for building roads and railroad projects. And it was not just unpaid, it was often very cruel and violent. And in addition, people had to basically turn their properties into cash crops rather than growing fields that would sustain their families, goods that would feed their families. They had to grow cash crops that would be sold to the Dutch at fixed prices, and this led to extreme debt and famines in land that was really, really productive, in beautiful, lush territory that no famine should ever have happened. So this map shows those islands, the Dutch islands of Sumatra in yellow and Java in red, and all of this is Indonesia. Just to put it into context, the Philippines were a U.S. colony, an American colony, and French Indochina was here, including Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And down here in the Spice Islands, in Indonesia, in Dutch Sumatra and Dutch Java, for example, the Netherlands, the Dutch forced the peasants to devote 20% of their land to cash crops, mainly coffee and sugar. And they had to sell the coffee and sugar to government contractors, to people from the Netherlands, at low fixed prices. And the Dutch made huge profits by selling these crops to the global market for much, much more than what they were paying for it from the poor farmers in Sumatra and Java. And this system really indebted many peasants to moneylenders, and again resulted in a series of famines in land that is so lush you drop a seed and trees will grow. What an unfortunate experience here. In Africa, unlike in India and in Southeast Asia, there was an European invasion and conquest that was unexpected and sudden and quite devastating. And there were so many various kingdoms in Africa that were unable to understand European motives and techniques, and they were completely overwhelmed by imperial invaders. There were some places, like the French conquest of Samori Tour in West Africa. It took many years for the French to finally subdue the state, and there are a very small number of states in Africa that managed to completely avoid European conquest, which is kind of surprising. We'll look at a map in a couple minutes to see where those places are. But this scramble for Africa, known as the Race for Africa or Partition of Africa again, was the attempt of Europeans to annex African territory during that new imperialism period, again 1881 till 1914. And it kind of, a turning point was what was called the Berlin Conference in 1884. Here there were representatives from 14 European countries, with of course no African representatives because Africans didn't count. And the goal for these 14 European countries was to divide the territory in Africa amongst European people. This was called for by Portugal and organized by Germany's Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, which was a rising imperialist power. And the problem with this is that it completely removed African autonomy, African self-governance, governance from all the different African states. And again, oftentimes it was a quick invasion and conquest, but sometimes it took many years of fighting. Something important to think about here and remember is that the original reason that European countries went into Africa and the moral reasoning behind imperialism was to free the slaves, because Europeans had risen above the horrible institution of slavery, and therefore they had to go into Africa, which still traded slaves within other African states, and abolish the slave trade by colonizing. And we'll look at what that means in Africa. So, white man's burden, here we go. This map, extremely colorful map, shows the European colonial powers in Africa. How many rainbows do you see here? The French have a huge chunk, the British, the Belgian Congo, we'll talk about that, one of the most horrifying stories I've ever studied. The Spanish a little bit, the Italians, the Germans. And look at what is an independent state. Tiny Liberia and Ethiopia. They were relentless and didn't give up and managed to hold off imperialist powers, which is kind of amazing. To give one case study of an economy of coercion, of an empire that coerced its way in, is King Leopold II of Belgium. His state, the Congo Free State, which started around the 1880s. This was probably the worst case of forced labor in Africa, and it cost millions of African lives. State-backed private companies, as in private economic companies, were backed by the state's military, as we've seen in many other cases, and they used a variety of extremely abusive tactics, including mutilation, to force the local population to collect ivory and rubber, because ivory that come from elephant tusks, which is now illegal in America to purchase. You can find it at like used goods and antique stores, but you can't purchase it new anywhere. It's illegal because it's horrible, because you have to murder a freaking elephant for a piece of white bone, basically. Unfreaking believable that anyone ever thought that this was okay, but I'm going to have historical empathy and take a deep breath and realize that people were horrible and still are in many parts of the world. And here as well, I'm not going to judge. And rubber. Rubber was used to make bicycle and automobile tires. And again, this was considered a humanitarian mission and civilizing, because black people from Africa are barbarian-like, they're barbarous. And in order to civilize them, they need forced labor, otherwise they're lazy. This was the most violent and deadly of the colonization experiences, with between 10 and 13 million people being killed. Again, there was a widespread contemporary belief, partly based on social Darwinism. We've already discussed who Darwin was. He was not a racist per se, but people manipulated his theories to create the idea that Africans were naturally apathetic and the only remedy was forced labor. So the Africans were to repay their colonial masters for giving them civilization, because these colonists were civilized. I think this is something we talked about on the first day of class. And we'll see here why I think the word civilization is kind of garbagey, because the civilizers were the most uncivilized of people as far as I'm concerned. From 1885 to 1908, it is estimated that the Congolese native population decreased by about 10 million people, and another historian would say up to 13 million people. And the number of causes for this loss under Leopold's reign include murder, starvation, exhaustion, and exposure from the elements based on forced labor, disease, and plummeting birth rates, because if you're exhausted, how are you going to procreate? Eventually, these abuses became public, and yielding to international pressure, in 1908, the Belgian parliament, the Belgian government that backed Leopold, decided to take over, and they annexed the Congolese Free State and turned it into Belgian Congo. And this effectively removed Leopold from power. However, over the next several decades, the inhumane practices that occurred in the Belgian Congo continued, and a huge number of Congolese people remained enslaved. It wasn't until 1959 that Belgian power finally started to erode, based on a series of riots in what was called Leopoldville, which is today Kinshasa. Oh my goodness. The Congo was finally emancipated from Belgium in 1960, and the modern Democratic Republic of the Congo was established. Men, of course, were gone, and women became head of household. And this had a lot of painful effects on the civilization there. Men were stolen to work in forced labor, and women had to not only take care of the home, but they had to also work outside of the home on the farms and to take care of financial matters. And this, of course, kind of led to and encouraged and necessitated polygamy, one man taking several wives, because there were very few men left. Okay. And here is, I love this. This is an official statement by the local Belgium administration in 1892. The natives must be induced or forced to throw off their natural indolence. Indolence means laziness, and improve their condition. A law, therefore, which imposes upon them light and regular work, yeah, frickin' right, picking rubber and killing elephants for ivory is not light and regular work. And this is the only means of giving them the incentive to work, because those Africans are so lazy. While it is an economic law, it is also a humanitarian law. And this is literally the official statement by the local Belgium administration, because this is what they're promoting. This is what they are explaining to the world as to why they are there, and causing damage that is so horrifying, it's hard to talk about. We'll look at some pictures in a moment, but just to point this out on a map, here is the Congo Free State, which became Belgian Congo in 1908 when King Leopold was kind of removed from power, but the abuses continued, and it wasn't until 1960 that it became the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And again, this rainbow map is so pretty until you realize how every color shows, except for right here and right here, all of the other colors are European-controlled territories in Africa. And this is a picture of the Belgian king, King Leopold II. And I'm going to show you a disturbing image here. These two kids are from the Congo Free State, which was again ruled personally by the Belgian King Leopold II until 1908. The chair on which that older boy sits, and also the wooden fence in the background, suggests that this picture might be taken on the grounds of a European facility, such as a mission or a hospital, with people, European people, concerned about the fate of these Congolese. The boys were part of a group of Congolese, a large group of Congolese, forced to collect rubber for private companies. And again, that rubber would be used for tires for bicycles and automobiles in Europe. These two children, had failed to collect the amount of rubber demanded by those private companies, and they were punished by having their hands chopped off. Because that would make them more efficient if they didn't have hands. What does this tell us about the European colonialism in Africa, the Belgian colonists in particular? Well, it suggests that colonial rule in Africa was often brutal, and infractions, tiny little challenges that workers gave to their masters, even though they weren't officially slaves, they were slaves, they would be punished with unspeakable cruelty. This colonization left scars in Africans on both individual levels and as a region, as an African region as a whole. A few more disturbing images. This is an image of prisoners who are taken if a man or men of the village would flee because they didn't want to become slaves. Compliance would be enforced through hostage taking of either chiefs or women or children from the villages. And of course, when you're a prisoner of war, this leaves people susceptible to rape, starvation, disease, elements, and these people would not be released until a ransom of rubber or ivory was paid. One more disgusting image. And it's important to remember that some people would gain higher rank by being workers or pawns of the colonial powers. So in this case, both the overseers, the punishers, and the guards are also Africans. In some cases, they might even have been from the same village. Gross, gross, gross. But again, we have to try really hard not to judge with our opinions now. We have to have historical empathy and understand the culture and the time and the place and the situation. It's so hard. It's so hard. Okay. So the British were also in Africa. What a shocker. And in some cases, they also coerced people to work for them. The British wanted gold, timber, lands, markets to sell their goods, and labor power. And Cecil Rhodes is one of those really big names. He was an Englishman. He was also a South African businessman and a politician and a mining magnate for diamonds. His mission was to expand the British Empire. He really wanted the British Empire to be covering the entire world. And he and a partner established what was called De Beers Diamonds, which still exists, unfortunately, in my opinion. And I'm going to show you a clip from the modern film Blood Diamonds. And it's kind of a very Hollywoodized film with a stupid romance, blah, blah, blah. But it kind of shows the milieu, the feeling of what was going on, where people were literally fighting and being taken hostage to work in diamond fields and mines, and children were being taken to be soldiers that had to commit acts of rape and murder and mutilation from age of 6 and 5 and up. And diamonds, they're called blood diamonds because these militia groups would make money off of diamonds and then buy weaponry, AK-47s, whatever, and that's how they conducted their war. And today they're supposedly diamonds that are certified blood-free or clean or whatever, but I have several friends in the industry and they say that no matter what, you never know. You never know where you are getting your diamonds. So I personally will never, ever, ever buy a diamond ever in my life, and no one that I know in my immediate family who talks to me who would also buy an actual diamond, because you don't know where it's coming from. It could easily be taken, and people still today can be in terrible conditions. It's a horrible, horrible, it's just gross. And there are so many alternatives. There are fake diamonds that are 99.99% the same materialistically as a diamond, as the composition. There's really no reason for a diamond. Anyways, let's look at this clip.
It came from the heart of the earth. A stone so rare, men will do anything to possess it. And all who touch it are left with blood on their hands.
That diamond is my ticket out of this God-forsaken continent.
So what are you? Smuggler?
You're a journalist. Some tell me you're here to make a difference, huh?
And you're here to make a buck?
You know, in America it's bling bling, but out here it's bling bang. Where did you bury it? The only reason you're still alive is because you haven't told anyone where it is.
You will find it for me. My son! Where is my son?
What if I helped you find your family? That makes us partners!
I am not your partner!
You're using him.
I'm using him, and you are using me, and this is how it works.
You're gonna steal this time.
I am his father! I must go find him! You show us where it's hidden?
That diamond is the only chance he has of getting his son back.
What if I wanted to go with you?
Hold on! I don't give a damn what's down there. Kill them all! Listen to me. Diamonds! Diamonds! My family, my home, I don't lost everything! I will find you. If it takes my life.
Okay. Well, that was fun. So again, that was very Hollywoodized, but it does show some of the extraordinary violence that happens based on the desire for diamonds. And it led to extraordinary, some of the most violent, disgusting, vile wars that I have ever studied in Sierra Leone, in Angola, and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where people were smuggling diamonds out of these countries, making tons of money and buying weaponry to foment wars. And they followed the example of their European colonists by maiming people, by cutting off legs and hands and arms of everyone, including men, women, and children. And when men didn't provide what they wanted, they would take their families, put them into homes, and burn their homes down with the people inside of them. Just disgusting stuff. So I think all diamonds really are just gross. And what's interesting is that diamonds weren't even popular until the 20th century, when De Beers started marketing. And people didn't have diamond engagement rings ever in history. They had other rings, other rubies and sapphires and emeralds, but diamonds didn't even become popular until it was well into De Beers' attempt at marketing. And it worked because almost every woman at least until recent times, wanted a diamond ring. It's forever. Blech. Sorry. I shouldn't provide my opinion, but there it is. And this is an image of Cecil Rhodes, and it's called From the Cape to Cairo, from the Cape of South Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, to Cairo in Egypt. And here we have a telephone wire showing the great progress that they are bringing to Africa, the great civilization. They are such wonderful Europeans, aside from the fact that they rape and mutilate and murder the people for ivory and rubber and diamonds and gold. Rhodes' philosophy, based on, of course, social Darwinism. Here's a quote from Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes. "I contend that we as in the English, white people, are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race." Wow, this guy is amazing. Just fancy those parts that are at present inhabited by the most despicable specimens of human beings. Who do you think he's talking about here? The most despicable specimens of human beings. He's talking about Africans. What an alteration there would be if they were to be brought under Anglo-Saxon influenced, English Christian influence. Oh, the ego on this guy. A couple more quotes from Rhodes and his imperialistic philosophy. Pure philanthropy. Philanthropy is doing good deeds and helping people, providing for other people. Pure philanthropy is very well in its way, but philanthropy plus 5% is a good deal better. Yay! And here's one more. To think of these stars that you see overhead at night, these vast worlds which we can never reach. I would annex the planets if I could. I'm sure you would, buddy. I'm sure you would. So, kind of in conclusion here, we have similar concepts and similar things happening in Africa that we see happening in India. Before the scramble for Africa, there was a local identity. There was a group of people who would see themselves as part of a village in Africa, or a kinship family group, or a language group. They spoke a similar language or had a core language that was connected and people could understand each other, or they considered themselves and identified with a city or a kingdom or an empire. However, the shared experience of European colonialism and racism that was established with this colonialism and the Atlantic slave trade, it led some Africans to see themselves as part of a larger continental African community. And this led some scholars to argue for the existence of African traditions and the influence of Africa on the rest of the world. Europeans created the idea of tribes. They found linguistic and material similarities between different communities, and this led them to define and group people as a tribe. And it was a European creation, but many African communities adopted this tribal identity as their own and used it as a communal identity. And this is when the idea of Pan-Africanism or African identity was generated. It is common belief or an understanding that when African kings would sell his own people to slavery, there was no his own people. He was selling people from a different kingdom. It wasn't his people, it was people who he had been fighting for 300 years or several generations or whatever. And it wasn't until colonialism and European supremacy and the degradation of all Africans as a race and a tribe based on European labels that the idea of someone being an African was created. A few people, including W.E.B. Du Bois, that's how he pronounces it, and Marcus Garvey, these are two African-American men who argued for a Pan-African identity. And they wanted this identity to transcend white boundaries of colony and nation state. So anyone who was black was part of an African identity. There was also gendering. And before we look at Peter Tosh, let's talk about gendering here. And again, we see this in all parts of the world where Europeans come in and take over. There is a really big importance placed on gender. White men are very hyper-masculine, and colonized men are effeminized and kind of women-like. That's what effeminized means, sort of, to put it in very rough and terrible terms. Sorry. Unless they fit into a useful category of a martial race, men in colonies were considered kind of weak. And a martial race like the Sikhs, S-I-K-H, they were considered a martial race, and so they were useful in a sense and became military people. White women were placed on an elite pedestal and had to be protected from the assumed sexual threat of native men. And colonized women, black women, were considered sexual or aggressive or masculinized because they had to, and many times, take over the home and business because their men were taken away. What a tough time to be an African. And we're going to take a very quick look. We'll end on Peter Tosh's song, African, and some of the really important lyrics. Don't care where you come from, as long as you're a black man, you're an African. Don't mind your nationality, you've got the identity of an African. And this, again, did not come from history. History, until very recent, until the economies of empire that arose in the late 1800s and early 1900s, people didn't consider themselves African, but thanks to European colonialism and racism, the idea of being an African arose. Let's take a look here.
Come from, as long as you're a black man, you're an African. Don't mind your nationality, you have got the identity of an African. Cause if you come from Clarendon, and if you come from Portland, and if you come from Westmoreland, you're an African. So don't care where you come from, as long as you're a black man, you're an African. Don't mind your nationality, you have got the identity of an African.
One of the silver linings, great music. To touch upon a couple other places, there was kind of a second wave of European conquests with settler colonialism and mass death in the Pacific. In places like Australia, New Zealand, and Hawaii, these were isolated populations that were invaded by white settlers and once again their diseases. And within a few generations, the indigenous populations had become almost completely impoverished and displaced minorities in their own lands, with huge chunks of the population dying. In Hawaii, for example, the population was said to be about 1 million people when the British captain James Cook arrived, and within a few years only 130,000 Hawaiians remained. In America and in Russia, they expanded as well. The United States and the Russian Empire both engaged in expansion across huge stretches of the continent's land, and they displaced Native Americans and Central Asians or Siberians. And the United States would also end up expanding into the Caribbean and Pacific Ocean. They seized Puerto Rico and Hawaii and the Philippines as part of the Spanish-American War. And similar cases of colonialism happened. The Japanese colonized Taiwan and Korea in East Asia, and we'll talk more about this soon, but with new industrialized ability in Japan, they flexed their muscle, so to speak, and they annexed the island of Taiwan and the Korean peninsula. And then, sadly, even though they claimed that Asians should be led by Asians, they engaged in a style of colonialism that was very similar to European examples, and in many times was so extremely brutal that the Taiwanese and Korean people wished that the Europeans were the ones to have colonized them. Anyways, this is it for this lecture. I can't say I hope you enjoyed, because it was pretty brutal, but I hope you learned something.